Hoje ia ser especial idane ita sei ba conversa itua o senhor Robin Christopher, antigo embaixador Reino Unido em Jakarta em 1999. Senhor idane ita amigo bodida, nebe que marca presença importante e aí tem história da libertação nacional. Ita outro rona, ita outro atene kata que em 1999 banheiro tem comandante bot Kay Rala Xanana Gusmão saiu de prisão domiciliária, se los ma for proteção, vai ter comandante e altura na ba, e mané, mas senhor embaixador Robin Christopher, liu se acordo entre Indonesia e Reino Unido, for proteção, vai ter um bot Kay Rala Xanana Gusmão, lebe ela ia embaixada Reino Unido nia e Jakarta durante semana rua nelarang molok saiu de Indonesia horisemo ba Austrália, mas tamuto acompanha rona história versão o senhor embaixador Robin Christopher. Agora está torna aí a senhor Robin Christopher na residência.
Totally safe.
Sir, thank you
How are you?
thank you for allowing us to come to your residence.
Well, it's my pleasure. My pleasure.
Pleasure.
I want to say two things. One, you've won this referendum. You've won freedom for your people. There will be a new country for the East Timorese. Don't return to war. Don't fight it. The world has accepted it. And number two, you must stay alive.
Dear friends, colleagues and compatriots, today is another special series for our program, and I have the honor to be given the opportunity and the chance and also the privilege to come to visit our great friend of Timor and the friend of our liberations, Sir Robin Christopher, former British ambassador in Indonesia in 1999. I'm here today to introduce to you this great friend of the then Commander-in-Chief Kay Rala Xanana Gusmão and our current President Dr. Ramos Horta. Hopefully we can learn more and more things about his engagement and personal relationship with our beautiful and great country. Sir Robin Christopher, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
How's life after a retirement from a highly achieved career, sir, please?
It's quieter, but very enjoyable. But I've been very lucky because I've seen a lot of the world, and I've been in interesting countries at interesting times. And the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. If you're a diplomat, it's a blessing. And I certainly was living in interesting times in Indonesia at the time of the birth of your country. And I was privileged to play a small role in that process at that time.
So, Sir Robin Christopher, if you allow me to, I would like to ask you to share with us your early beginnings until the peak of your career, how it all began. From the day like where you born, raised, studied, and to become a top diplomat, please.
I was born in a small town by the sea, Bexhill, and I remember as a child looking out of my bedroom window and I could see the sea. And the sea played a big part in my life, my childhood. And I was born in 1944, just at the end of the war. And my father, who had been a soldier and had spent many years away from home, fighting in North Africa, and then in Europe. He was at Dunkirk, he was in the Normandy landings and all the main events. And he retired from the army immediately after the war. And he worked in a number of other capacities, one of which was working in the 1950s with Hungarian refugees after the 1956. So he had an international flavour about his outlook and his life, very much supported by my mother as well. And he was very anxious that his children, my brother, older brother, and myself, should grow up in a climate that was friendly towards our former enemy. He was one of the people working on an organisation called the Voluntary Service Overseas, which was a sort of British Peace Corps, but slightly younger. And because of that influence and him, my first experience of serious travel was after school, before university, age 19. I went as a volunteer on VSO to Bolivia, and for a year before I went to university. And I taught English at a teacher's training college in La Paz. I lived with a Bolivian family, and I had so many adventures. It was wonderful. And so my frame of mind was very attuned to seeing the world as much as possible. And after university, I got a scholarship to go to the United States for graduate school in the United States at the Fletcher School of International Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. I went to university before that in Oxford and studied politics, philosophy and economics. And I taught briefly before joining the Foreign Office at Sussex University, taught philosophy, which I enjoyed very much. And then I was sent, when I joined the Foreign Office, 2 weeks later, I was sent to New York with the British delegation to the 25th anniversary of the United Nations in 1970. So that was how it began.
Right.
It was Bolivia was probably the most influential year of my life. Living there and traveling a lot, and all my students were older than I was. Living with a family, with a Bolivian family, and speaking Spanish all the time. It was a wonderful experience.
So that was basically your first international contact.
Exactly. And I did some quite adventurous traveling down in the jungle and across Peru and up to Mexico, sort of attached to that year. And yeah, and then came back 3 years in Oxford, and then another 2 years in America, graduate school. And into the Foreign Office and the new life.
I noticed that your first posting was apparently in India.
India, yes.
Could you share with us, please?
I was in Delhi at a particularly interesting time. Mrs. Gandhi was Prime Minister, and she ran into big difficulties. As a result of which she declared an emergency, which basically turned India, in the first time since independence, into a dictatorship. All foreign press were kicked out of the country. There was complete press control, no freedom of speech, and it was for a short time a dictatorship. But that was the second half of my time there, because I was working there for 3 years, and of course it eventually came right. She, who was always basically a Democrat at heart, did eventually call another election, which she lost. But then, 4 or 5 years later, she was re-elected. But to go through that experience of seeing the world's largest democracy transformed overnight into a dictatorship was extraordinary. My job was to try and understand what was going on. I was the political officer in charge of the domestic Indian political scene. And there was another political officer who looked at foreign policy. But that's why I'd learnt the Hindi. And so it was my job to try and make sense of what was happening in those difficult times. It's a wonderful country, just a wonderful country, and I love it dearly. Then I was back in London for a while, and my next posting abroad was to Zambia in 1980. And that was very interesting. I was there as, in fact, deputy head of mission, and we had quite a big aid program there, which was quite productive. We were on very good terms with President Comander, who was the president, and indeed he paid a state visit, his first state visit to London, to stay at Buckingham Palace with Her Majesty the Queen while we were out there, so we were busy organising all that, and it all went very well. The next post abroad was to Spain.
Right, in Madrid.
In Madrid, where I was Director for Trade Promotion and heading up the economic side of the embassy as a councillor. And 4 years. The Spanish from Bolivia was very helpful, obviously. Under Felipe Gonzalez, and we had a state visit by the Queen to Madrid, followed by a prime ministerial visit by Mrs. Thatcher to Madrid, all in the same year. So we were quite busy. We're looking for partnerships and business in every sector. And I spent a lot of time with chambers of commerce in this country. I would fly back and talk to chambers of commerce about opportunities in Spain. They're looking for partnerships, new technology and new management that we could offer. And they had the market. previous time back I'd been in the press department at the Foreign Office as one of the jobs. This time I was working in the Cabinet Office when Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister, and she and President Mitterrand decided to build the Channel Tunnel, and I found myself as part of the team negotiating the Channel Tunnel. We were 7 aside. It was run by the Ministry of Transport, but I was the Cabinet Office representative, and I looked after the, as it were, the political bilateral side of it, and that took up a solid year, with other things as well, but with our French colleagues, we met for a while. We met every week, alternately Paris and London, and then we did the assessment of the bids from the contractors to build the Channel Tunnel, of which there were 3 main ones, but 5 in all, and then I was involved in all that, and also in the cabinet discussions of the choice. Just before I did the Channel Tunnel, I'd been heading up the Department on Southern Africa in the Foreign Office at the time of Mandela's release. Later in life, after retirement, I worked with a foundation that he had set up with Nelson Mandela as patron.
Is it the Global Leader Foundation?
The Global Leadership Foundation. And I got to know F.W. de Klerk much better after his retirement, and mine. Ethiopia we were lucky because they'd finished their civil war. They'd thrown out Mengistu, and Meles Zenawi was the young, rather brilliant leader of the new Ethiopia. Eritrea had got its independence, but I was accredited to Eritrea as well, and in those days you could drive. You know, I drove to Asmara and back. It took a couple of days. Then from there I went directly to Indonesia, to Jakarta, and I really wanted, in our system you bid for positions you want.
Like you apply for it.
You apply,
right.
Yes. You're told what is coming up, you know, at the end of your present posting, this is what is available. And you say, I'm interested in that. And I had visited Indonesia on my way back from my first posting in India. I'd been to Bali and Jakarta basically, and loved it, and thought it very interesting, but another world, completely different. That was all I knew of it. But I knew that President Suharto had been in office for 30 years or more. He was getting old, and just possibly something might happen in the next 3 years. Who knows? Give it a go. So I said, I want to go to Indonesia, because there may be change there, and change in our world, as you know, is always interesting. And there certainly was change. There certainly was change. I had 1 year of President Suharto, That included a visit by Robin Cook. His first visit outside Europe was to Indonesia. Yeah. And relations were not good with Suharto, largely because we did not accept that East Timor was part of Indonesia. And nor did anybody else in Europe, the European Union. And that was always, East Timor was always the thorn in the side of Indonesian foreign policy. The thorn that prevented Indonesia from playing as big a role as it might have done on the world stage was because of the occupation of East Timor. Suharto was re-elected president in February of 1998. I'd arrived in May of 97. He appointed as his vice president Habibie, against the wishes of his party, the military, everybody else around him. But he said, I want Habibie to be my vice president. And it was a dictatorship. Habibie became vice president. But within 3 months, Suharto was out.
And Habibie was in.
He'd been elected with Habibie as vice president in February. He was out by May because of the financial collapse. Crismon, it was called. Do you remember Crismon?
Exactly, crisis monetaire.
Can I tell you a lovely story about Crismon?
Go for it.
Whether you include it or not, up to you. There was a story going around in Jakarta at that time when Suharto was still in charge, that God had summoned Bill Clinton, whoever was the leader in China at that time, and Suharto. And he summoned them and he said, I've called you to tell you that the world is going to end in 3 days. And to tell you that you have to go back to your peoples and tell them. So Bill Clinton went back to the US and said, I met God, and God said, God bless America, and the world is going to end in 3 days. The Chinese Prime Minister went back to Beijing and said, comrades, it's all bad news. God exists, and the world is going to end in 3 days. And Suharto came home, and he said, went on television, and he said, my children, it's all good news. God summoned the 3 most important people in the world, and he included me. And Crismon is going to finish in 3 days.
Well, that's a rather nice, story.
Anyway. Well, that brings me to the threshold of my involvement in East Timor, because ambassadors, because we did not accept that East Timor was part of Indonesia, ambassadors were not permitted by Brussels to visit East Timor. Basically, it's what the Portuguese said. No ambassadors should visit because that implies recognition of the inclusion. So we didn't visit. A member of my staff could go, and so I kept in touch with what was happening, but I couldn't go. Then Suharto left the scene, and Habibie took over, and I thought and we had the presidency of the, how the European,
right.
the presidency of the European Union. So I was in the chair of the European ambassador, and I thought, come on. And I talked to my Portuguese colleague, and I said, there's an opportunity here. Let's fix up a troika, a visit by the troika of you and me and the Austrian, as it was, who was going to be the next one, because we had the presidency. And so we, and she agreed with me.
And that was Ana Gomez.
That was Ana Gomez.
Right.
Yes, yes. Dear friend, and my government agreed, and eventually the Indonesian government agreed, rather reluctantly, but they, this is what they're trying to get us to do all the time, and now we were saying, yes, we want to go. So we went.
And was it your own very first visit to Timor?
Yes. We arrived, and there was a big demonstration at the airport, organized by the governor. To welcome us. We settled into our hotel, and we arranged to meet a lot of different organizations, students, the church, Bishop Bello, and word got out that we were going to go to the cathedral. I think we arrived on a Saturday, and we were going to go to the cathedral on Sunday morning to meet Bishop Bello. And we were told by the governor that that would not be safe and that we shouldn't go. Okay, well, you do what you're told in those circumstances. He was our host, so we stayed in the hotel, and I remember we were meeting a group of students when there was a lot of noise outside, and I looked out the window, and word had reached the crowds outside the cathedral who had amassed there to meet us, that we were going to be there. And then they were told we were not, we were in our hotel. So they were marching down the road towards our hotel, down that main road, parallel to the seashore. And from the hotel window, I could see that in fact the hotel was surrounded by Indonesian soldiers to protect us. Trouble. Potentially violent trouble. So we put our heads together, the three of us, and we said there's only one way to get around this. We must go up the road and meet them. Because if we meet them, then the soldiers won't fire, because they might hit us. And that's what we did. So we broke through the lines and we went up the road to meet the crowd, and the students went ahead to tell the people who were coming from the cathedral who we were, and that we were coming out to meet them. So we all got back to the hotel together. But this was 1,000 people. And of course the soldiers had disappeared. they ceased to have a role, apart from sort of very much in the background. So that situation was diffused, and then they all gathered around the hotel, and I was given a microphone and told to say why we were here. So I told them why we were here, that we were on a fact-finding mission, and that we wanted to hear all views from all sections of the community, and we wanted to, and we would be all reporting back to our capitals. And I remember there was a tree outside the hotel, and there was a big branch that had 6 people sitting on it. And the branch collapsed, and everybody laughed, and it just lightened the atmosphere.
Well, okay.
You know, it suddenly became, you know, a good...
More of a relaxed situation.
Yeah. So everybody left peacefully. I said, it's time to go home, and we're here. Rest assured, your views will be represented, you know.
At that time, I'm sure, you know, every visit by foreign dignitaries was considered as a window of opportunity.
Well,
so
this is the first time any of us have been
exactly.
in Europe.
And I'm sure, you know, at that time I would like to believe we wanted to use those opportunities.
Yeah.
And I did not know that you were actually you're part of this Troika team.
I led it.
You led it, exactly.
It was my idea.
Wow, wonderful.
But remember, that was a year before the actual referendum.
Right.
14 months before.
Right.
We then were due to go to Baucau because I'd heard quite a lot about the bishop in Baucau at that time.
Right.
Was a good man, and I wanted to meet him, and so we went to Baucau, and this cavalcade went, the 3 of us with 1 person from Brussels as well, so 4 of us in a minibus, and behind there was a truckload of Indonesian soldiers, and behind them there was BBC and CNN television.
Oh wow. It was a big thing.
Yeah, it was a big thing. And because our first meeting had been with the governor, who assured us that everything was peace and quiet, until a stone came through the window into the governor's office from the crowd outside, and it got really rough, and they had to lock the doors of the palace while they cleared the crowd from outside, because they were pelting the building with us inside it. It was extraordinary. I mean, our little minibus, when we had our meetings, we were almost carried by the crowd. We went at walking pace to people's houses, you know, the leaders of the of your community. Anyway, we arrived in Baucau and were told by the military that this is not like Dili, it's all totally quiet here. And then we went sort of over the hill after our briefing, down the hill into Baucau, and the crowd came up the hill to greet us. And we drove to the cathedral.
So there was basically a crowd everywhere.
And we drove to the cathedral, and our minibus was allowed into the cathedral grounds. But the military escort, which began with some cars with soldiers inside, and was followed up by I don't know, a truckload of soldiers. The gates were shut on them on the grounds that you know, the military were not allowed on church property. And that first car was blocked by the gate, but was cut off from the other military. And the crowd surrounded it and started bouncing the car like this. And a young soldier in the back panicked. And he fired his gun out of the window and he killed the demonstrator. And that prompted a complete change to the entire mission, the Troika visit, and became front page of Time magazine, a sort of incident in Baucau sort of thing. And so we were trapped inside the cathedral with the bishop. I was determined that we would not go outside and be photographed with a dead body or anything like that. I mean, you know, none of that. So we got out of there, but we had to, and we went back, and we had to change our schedule quite a bit, and we cancelled our dinner with the governor. We saw Bishop Bello instead, because we hadn't been able to see him at the cathedral. And the Indonesian government decided to send an aeroplane to get us out of there, to cut short the Troika visit by a day. And so at 5 o'clock in the morning, after returning from Baucau, without anybody knowing, we left the hotel and went to the airport, because there was going to be a demonstration at the airport at the time of our departure. So we left early on an Indonesian military plane. So that was the Troika visitor.
What a visit!
And the Baucau incident, which was a great tragedy, was as important as anything else in formulating our views and the repercussions, you know, internationally. I can't remember the name of the bishop.
His name is Bishop Basílio Nascimento.
Yes.
His name was.
Yes.
His name is Basílio Nascimento. Yeah.
He was a fine man.
Yes.
I liked him.
And before he returned back to Timor, he was in Portugal. I think he was a university professor, and he went through all his training and priesthood in Portugal.
Yes.
So yeah, he was known to be a very fine gentleman.
He was a fine man. Anyway, then you know, things became very difficult, because the genie was out of the bottle in East Timor, and the military were clamping down, and the militias were moving in, and I paid, I think, 3 or 4 more visits during that time, one of which was with the minister, Derek Fatchett. Yes, it was a very difficult time, and a very dangerous time. I know that the Financial Times correspondent there, who was a friend of mine, Sanders, was shot. He was riding on the back of a motorcycle in Dili, just very soon after our visit, and he was shot and killed. Anyway, moving ahead, it all moved to persuading the Indonesian government to hold a referendum. One other feature of our minister's visit, Derek Fatchett, this of course was under Habibie, not under Suharto.
Already under Habibie?
Oh yes.
Right.
And I managed to get our minister into the prison where Xanana was held, and for him to give what was his first ever press conference.
Xanana's press conference?
Yes, was in the prison, to the BBC.
Do you still remember where was it? Which prison? Was it in Chipinang or was it in Salemba?
I think it was Chipinang.
Chipinang. Then I believe it must have been the first interview he gave.
It was. And I got the BBC in as well.
Right.
So that was the first time I met him.
Okay. Wow.
In prison.
How was your impression?
With the BBC.
Right. So that was your first contact with Xanana Gusman?
Yes. Yes.
Well, now let's move into the most important
so
point.
that was the Fatchett visit. And Fatchett, he came sometime before the referendum, but after the Troika visit, during that year.
Right.
You know, so it was probably something like June of '99, something like that.
Right. Very close to referendum.
Quite close.
Right.
Quite close. Let's come on to the referendum.
Exactly.
I was anxious to be there. Indeed, many Europeans were, including Anna as well, as an observer. The referendum was interesting in that it was a referendum for autonomy. Habibie persuaded his government that they should put a proposal, a positive proposal for autonomy, to the people of East Timor. And that was accepted, because the understanding, obviously, was if you didn't want that, you voted no. That was the only rule. And I went as an observer, and we had a cohort of British police who went, who you know, and they went a few weeks beforehand for the referendum and got to know the layout of the land and you know, what were the sensitive spots and everything else. And I went and arrived shortly, 2 or 3 days before it began, and I stayed with the police. It was known as the British Police House, and I sort of had a bed there. And one of the British police told me his story, that he'd been out patrolling early one morning, and he'd been stopped by somebody in the street out in the countryside, and said, "What are you doing?" And he explained that he was here checking out preparations for the referendum. And he was told, there are a lot of people in the mountains who want to vote, who are afraid to vote. There's a whole community, a whole town up there. Come back to this spot tomorrow morning and I will take you up there. So he did, this policeman. Drove up in his Land Rover. There was the guy with him, waiting for him.
Must have been Mick. I know this gentleman.
And drove up into the mountains and wondered whether he was about to be taken hostage or, you know, what was going on. And came across this community, a large community, who really wanted to vote. But their nearest voting place would be Lakeisha. And Lakeisha was another story. They didn't want to vote in Lakeisha. They wanted to vote in their own town. So he arranged that there would be ballot boxes in their little village. I mean, it wasn't a big place, but I mean, it was enough to qualify, and the situation near Laetitia, you know, the hill people above Laetitia had the right to vote. And so I thought, this sounds interesting. So I appointed myself to be the observer for that village, for the vote. And at 5 o'clock in the morning, we got in the...
Do you remember the village names?
The actual village. It's in the mountains just behind Laetitia. I don't, to be honest. I mean, it was 2 or 3 villages that all came together in one place. Right. And very near Laetitia, because I spent the morning up in the mountains. I mean, they were, you know, we arrived at 6:30 or 7. Everybody was out in queues to vote. It was all over by midday, you know, and there was singing and dancing, everything else, you know, absolutely. It was celebrating independence already, you know. There's a little community up there. It was a delight. And then I said, let's go and have a look at Laetitia, down the hill, where they would have had to have voted otherwise. Just extraordinary. Absolute silence. Queues of people standing in the midday sun all day, surrounded by militias wearing the red bandanas on their heads, carrying guns. I think they were carrying guns, I'm not absolutely certain about it, but they were there, you know, absolute silence. And the contrast between, you know, where we'd been in the morning and what was happening in Laetitia.
In the main town.
In the main town, Laetitia. Just, I mean, to this day, it was extraordinary, just extraordinary. And there had been the killings in Laetitia beforehand, I think. Anyway, that all happened, and I went back to the British police house at the end of the day, and with all the British police contingent, we sat around and swapped stories. And then there was one young policeman who was missing. He hadn't got back yet, and he came in rather late. Said, "Where have you been?" He said, "Well, I've had an extraordinary day. I've been collecting ballot boxes by helicopter all around the territory, you know." And we landed in this field up in the hills, and I was where there'd been a polling station, and I was loading the ballot boxes, and suddenly we came under fire from the bushes surrounding the fields. And if you're a helicopter pilot, you don't stick around with that sort of scene. So he was ordered to get on board and to take off. And as he got on board with the last box of ballot papers, it slipped from his fingers. Just one box. But he was safe. And he came back and told us this rather dramatic story. And he ended by saying, you know, he said, "This doesn't happen in Hastings."
Of course not.
And I always remember, this doesn't happen in Hastings. Anyway, that was...
So it did go missing?
What?
The ballot box?
Oh, one ballot box.
I see.
I mean, 60 votes or something. And the helicopter got away, and there was no damage done. But they actually came under fire. This doesn't happen in Hastings. Anyway, I stayed on for a day, but then all the observers left. I mean, everybody left after that. And as we left, we all had a meeting with, or was it Domenio at that time? Who was the special representative of Kofi Annan. You know, we'd done our job, and we all left. And of course, over the next 3 or 4 days, 300,000 people were shipped off to West Timor. Or however many people it was, but it was...
just like this.
Just like this. Anyway, I went back, and back to Jakarta, and I went to see Xanana, who by this time had been released from prison because with the referendum and all the rest.
To a prison house?
To a safe house that was
Safe
outside.
house.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, non-custodial, as it were. But I mean a safe house, yes. And I was good friends with Rocky Fernandez,
Roque Rodriguez.
Rocky Rodriguez,
Right.
and this is his wife,
Paula.
Paula was one of the three.
I think Paula was one of Xanana's assistants.
Yes.
With,
Exactly.
Christy Swart.
Exactly. This was really the first time I got to know Paula. I think it was post referendum. Because I'm not sure she was around when I visited him in prison. No, she wouldn't have been, because that was in Jakarta. Anyway, I was chatting with Paula before I saw Xanana, and she said we're really concerned because you know, if this is if this all goes well, and I think Kofi Annan had just announced the result of the referendum that day, that morning. He's going to be flown back, and the militias are in charge, and he'll be killed. And he's determined to go back. So I took that on board, and we went in and joined Xanana, and I think it was just Paula, Xanana, and me. And I told him my experiences of the referendum, and you know, now that Kofi Annan had declared the result that he'd won, you know, because he definitely had. It was either that day or the day before, because he had definitely, because we were sort of celebrating. And during that meeting, Xanana's telephone rang twice, and the first one was from TMR, and who was calling him to say that the Indonesian military and their cohorts were raping and pillaging the village countryside, and all his command of guerrillas, they were all cantoned in the hills to keep them out of the way for the referendum. And he said they're coming to us saying, come and help us because we're being attacked. And Xanana said, we mustn't get involved. That would be restarting the civil war. We've got the result. And TMR said, I just can't stop them. We're going to have to. I mean, you know, my men will not stay here when their families are being attacked by Indonesian soldiers. And he hung up on him. And Xanana told me this conversation. I mean, obviously it was all in Portuguese or whatever. And he said, and my commander in the field has hung up on me. He can't stop them. And then a few minutes later there was another call. And this was from a priest in the church in the village of Svai, who got through directly to Xanana and said, we are however many, 100 people, 200 people.
Was it already at the British embassy or still At the
No, no, no,
prison
no,
house.
no, at the safe house. At the safe house. There's nothing about British Embassy yet. And we are surrounded. And they're going to burn the church down, and they're going to kill us all. But we wanted to speak to you, our leader, before we die. And he said, we wanted to call you to tell you that we will die as free men. That was the message. And it was just an extraordinary emotional moment. And here was this icon, this commander of, who'd won this referendum, and against this background. And I thought, I must go. He's got so many other things to deal with rather than me at the moment. But I said, before I go, I want to say two things. One, you've won this referendum. You've won freedom for your people. There will be a new country for the East Timorese. Don't return to war. Don't fight it. The world has accepted it. Number two, you must stay alive, because you are all they've got. I didn't say, don't let them fly you back to Dili, but that's what I meant, because of the conversation I'd had with Paula before. I just said, number two, you must stay alive.
It was a very profoundly emotional message.
And I left. And a very emotional time. Really, I arrived back home. I'm not sure I slept that night. Because at something like 1:30 in the morning, or maybe it was next morning, I can't remember the time of the phone call, but I got a, yeah, I think it was. I think it was the same night, because at about 1:30 in the morning, I got a call from Xanana saying, shortly after you left, I was informed that the Indonesian government was going to fly me back to Dili the day after tomorrow. This may have been the next morning, not at 1:30 in the morning. I don't know. And he said that they want to fly me back to Dili. I've talked. I've thought carefully about what you said, and I was wondering, could I possibly come and stay with you? And I said, yes, of course. I'll just check it out with Robin Cook, and with the Indonesian government as well, because the Indonesian, yeah. And be in touch. But yes, from my point of view, absolutely. I got an immediate response from London saying, absolutely fine, we'll make the appropriate arrangements for protection and stuff like that. It's just for a few days, you know. And the Indonesian government, what's his name, the foreign minister?
Alatas?
Alatas, yes. Alatas, who I knew very well, actually, and for my mind of names is going in my 80th year. But very fun. I thought he was a fine man, actually. and he read, yeah, anyway, enough of that. He was actually rather relieved, I think. He said, of course you can take him in if you want, if that's what you want to do, but that's putting yourself, you know, in the middle of it all. And I said that, you know, Robin Cook was prepared to do this, and with very much hopes that you agree. He said, I agree. So that's how it happened. That Xanana said no, and I wanted to go and stay at the British Embassy. And Muladi was the
Minister of Justice.
Minister of Justice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have to say it was terrific. Terrific. I think it was Muladi who opened the door to the press conference in the prison, I think, and allowed, I approached him about that with the BBC and that, you know. And Aritas put me in touch with Muladi about arrangements, and it was the following day, I mean, yes, 2 days later, I think. Xanana was driven up with a few trucks of soldiers, sort of following, and I think Muladi came too, and he came and joined us. And meanwhile, we got out from London a group of you know, special security people who specialise in this sort of thing. We always refer to them as the Men in Black, to protect the embassy, because, as you know, our old embassy, it's no longer our embassy anymore, was right on what is the sort of equivalent of Trafalgar Square in Jakarta. And was overlooked by a lot of high-rise buildings, and we didn't want any sharpshooters. So we put up lots of tents, lots of warnings and things, so he was properly protected. And the embassy was well protected anyway. And that special security group stayed for as long as he was with us. And he was with us for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. And during that time, a lot of things happened. The Security Council sent a delegation out, 3 or 4 people, one of whom was our representative in New York. And they obviously met him at the embassy, because he was staying. And I used to come down after work each day and for a cup of coffee or a beer with him and see how he was getting on. I had the awful duty on one day to convey to him news that we had heard or picked up from his people, that his father had been killed, his mother had gone missing or something like that. And I broke that news to him one day. The next day, the news was that he had been found. So I came down and we celebrated.
I actually know the story, but
Yeah.
you know where I found out?
What?
I found out through Ana Gomes' latest book.
Oh, really?
It's called Diplomacia de Todo Terreno, it's the Portuguese version, where she shared all those moments. And I can tell you she mentioned your names a few times in the book, particularly during the time where they all stayed at your embassy. So I found out how you broke the news to him, and eventually it was just a rumor. And Xanana was very brave in taking.
I had a rather lovely moment. Obviously, it's quite a large embassy. I mean, we had about 60 employees or something, Indonesian employees.
And after that, the room was named Xanana's room, was it
Yes,
correct?
it's still, yes. And there's a picture of him when he arrived,
Right.
the Xanana room. In the Xanana. I've seen it, because I've been back there once, yeah. Yeah. No, I thought the local staff should meet him. I mean, he was in the building, shut off corner of the ground floor, all properly protected and all that. And so I summoned everybody to the bar, to the refreshment room on the ground floor one day at lunchtime, and said, "You're going to meet him." And went and fetched him and brought him in. And it was just fascinating, because there was such a hush of expectation and amazement and surprise and this culmination of everything that we'd all been going through in the embassy, because many more Indonesians than British people.
Right.
I mean, it's the way things are. And but he was just so natural, and that smile. Within minutes, they were just all over him. They were just, he was treated like a rock star, the moment he came into the room. And everybody wanted to shake hands and touch him, and all the girls were just, it was lovely, it's lovely. And of course, once that had happened, he was a most welcome guest.
Right, a true hero back then.
He was a true hero. Yeah.
Big hero for the country, yes.
True hero. Yeah. So that went on for 2 weeks, and this delegation came out from New York, and I really encouraged them to insist with the Indonesian government that they go to East Timor and see what was happening, because the place was being torn apart by the militias and everything. And so rather reluctantly they went, and General Wiranto went with them, which was very important. I didn't go on that trip. There's no reason why I should have gone. I wasn't any part of that. That was the UN thing, and of course Ian was out there at that stage as well. He was there then, and of course Wiranto found himself in the middle of a ruined city, a ruined town. And pictures were taken of him in front of, the burnt out cafe, what became the burnt out cafe, the famous place. And he was asked on camera, are you really sure that you have control here, as you claimed in Jakarta that you did? He couldn't say that. He said, no, something must be done. Something must be done. Okay, so that moved us on to what should be done, which was a peacekeeping force. And that really got off the ground as a result of the UN mission from the Security Council coming out. and yeah. Now, Ian was, he stayed on, didn't he?
I think he stayed on for a few days and then went to Australia alongside with the refugees.
Right.
They were taken from UN compound,
Yes.
about 3,000 people. They were flown to Darwin.
That's right.
That's right.
Because a lot of people took refuge in the
UN compound.
yeah.
They were all taken.
UNIMET, wasn't it?
Exactly,
UNIMET.
UNIMET. And they were all taken to Australia. And I think Ian was one of the very last
Yeah. I remember.
personnel to
I remember. I was in touch
to
with
leave
him
Delhi.
quite frequently, and particularly when the bombs came over the wall. And I rang him and say, "Don't you think you should leave?" He said, "No, I'm not leaving." I said, "Fine." He's very brave. Obviously, he wasn't going to stay with us forever, and so I asked Muladi, "How much notice do you need to get him to the airport?" And he said, "I will need 2 hours notice for his time of departure, whenever it is, in the next week or whatever." And so Xanana decided, and Paula and the others, on their program for departures and everything, and gave me the date. And I gave the date to the magnificent lady from British Airways, who was working for Qantas, but would be in charge of the flight, because she had to push 20 people off that flight in order to accommodate this, because she also only had 2 hours notice. The important thing was to absolutely minimize the time so that we could get him to the airport safely. So nobody knew, nobody outside his team and my embassy knew that he was going to leave until 2 hours before he actually left. And then when I gave Muladi the 2 hours notification, he said, "I'm coming too." And he showed up, having got the necessary soldiers who'd been, all their phones had been taken away and all the rest, but there was a convoy of accompanying soldiers. But he turned up in his own car, drove up and said, "I'm coming with you." And so we all put on bulletproof vests. Xanana, Muladi, and me, and my driver. And it was 9 o'clock at night or 8 o'clock at night, because I think the flight was at 9. Under cover of darkness, and said goodbye to Merrill and the children. It's the only time I've ever worn a bulletproof vest. And we drove to the airport, and Muladi and Xanana in the back seat of the Jaguar, and I was in the front seat, the driver. And yeah, it was a big moment, certainly a big moment in my life, and wonderful to see that the two of them, Muladi representing the continuation of the Indonesian state, as it were, but enlightened form, and the representative of the new Timor-Leste in the car. That's a big moment. Big moment. one of the big moments of my life. And when we arrived at the airport, we discovered that the telephones had been ringing of the airline saying, "Who's on this flight? Who's on this flight?" Word had got out that something might be happening, but it was perfectly safe. And I actually saw him onto the airplane.
You actually went?
I actually saw him onto the airplane.
So you saw him on?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, to the bottom of the steps.
What a chapter. I think our audience will be pleased and glad and perhaps thankful to have learned this from you. I think this is the first time you actually share to a Timorese TV, sort of say. Right. And then after that, how many times you actually went back to Timor to perhaps visit Xanana or even witness our independence celebrations?
Oof. I did go back to, I was at the time of, when were the independence celebrations?
20th May 2002.
That's
I think
right.
at that time you were already in Argentina. Right.
But the Foreign Office generously asked me to go the other side of the world for that. So I went back for the independence celebrations. Yeah. And I suppose that was that was the next time I saw him. But that wasn't the end of the story on East Timor for me by any means, because we were quite heavily engaged in putting Dili back together again. In fact, I think we were attributed the privilege of having turned the lights back on in Dili after all the cables had been cut, by the militias and stuff. And we had a good team helping with the rehabilitation, and we went back. Meryl and I went back about 2 months later, and we did a tour, and we went to Sai. We saw the church. Since then, since I retired in 2004, I've been back many times with the Global Leadership Foundation, because Global Leadership Foundation was set up with its members are former ministers and heads of state in retirement, but with a lot of experience that they can share with heads of government who are not in retirement, who are in office. And I thought East Timor would be a possible classic case. And of course, the other connection that the Global Leadership Foundation has with Timor-Leste is that your president, Jose Ramos Horta, is a member of it. He is one of the distinguished former leaders who make up the membership of the foundation. And it's always been, while I was involved with the foundation, it's always been a great pleasure to be working with him in that new capacity for both of us.
Sir Robin Christopher, it's been 22 years now. Xanana is now still our Prime Minister. Your friend, Dr. Ramos Horta, still the President of the Republic, and you are still here. And us as the newer generations, we look up at you all as our examples and great inspiration. Timor-Leste is now a full-fledged democracy where freedom of speech is totally respected. Of course, we cannot expect a country from zero to infinite just in a short period of time. Hiccups along the way, remains a fragile state. But with the transition to the newer generations, I believe the Timorese people are totally committed in making it a prosperous country. With that, Sir Robert Christopher, I would like you to convey a short message to the people of Timor, who now call this great country, the United Kingdom, home, and also those back home in Timor-Leste. A short message from a great friend, Mr. Robert Christopher, please.
Well, it's been a great pleasure to spend this time with you, Mr. Ambassador, Your Excellency.
Oh, thank you.
and to reminisce about the important period that I had the privilege of sharing with you and the people of Timor-Leste at the birth of your nation. I consider myself very fortunate to have had that experience, and some of my dearest memories from my career are related to your country. So I wish your people every good thing, and all the people from your country who are currently living in my country. I hope you feel that you are among friends the way I always felt whenever I visited Timor-Leste. Thank you.
Dear friends and compatriots, this is the story of Sir Robert Christopher. Thank you. La